He was born to Julia, whose husband, Alfred Lennon, was a seafaring man who was away at sea for most of the time and showed absolutely no interest whatsoever in his infant son. Julia was, I don't know quite how to describe the poor lady, but she wasn't the kind of lady, woman, girl, who was fit to be a mother. There's no question about that. And so she handed John over to Aunt Mimi, to her sister, to her elder and far more responsible sister, to raise the child.
It was a very complicated background, you know. I didn't know his mother, but his Aunt Mimi, the famous Aunt Mimi, I knew very well, who was a well-meaning, though, you know, somewhat of a tyrant.
My mother would say to me, now stay away from that Lennon. That's what he was known as, that Lennon. So he had a reputation from very early on, although the impression I get is that Mimi thought the sun shone out of his various orifices. Little did she know.
Aunt Mimi was somewhat exacting as a person, and I think this certainly left its mark.
So you find John being torn from a very early age, I think. He wanted to be like the lower-class people who wore their leather jackets and their tight jeans. Yet at the same time, at home, Aunt Mimi was trying to pull him up, and hopefully he'd do good at school and go to college and maybe have a nice white-collar job in a bank. This is probably what, heaven forbid, really, a bank. John Lennon, think about it. Heaven forbid that would happen. And Aunt Mimi, this is what Aunt Mimi probably planned for her adopted son.
We lived in this little village called Woolton, and the church was right on the top of the hill. John and his friends lived over one side, I lived over the other side, but being all Church of England, we ended up in the Church of England Kids Sunday School. People said to me, you know, were there any signs of John being a rebel in the early days? Well, he used to spend his 2 or 3 pennies collection on bubble gum and chewing gum, you know, in Sunday school, and would probably come and put 1 penny, and the other 2 had gone on chewing gum. And I think we all expected a bolt from heaven to blast John when he was sitting there, but it never happened. So from a very early age, he was defiant of authority. You know, I don't think any of the rest of us would have had the courage, or the devilment maybe it was, to spend our collection on bubblegum and chewing gum. I mean, that was a evil thing to do, that.
When John was 14, 15, 16, his mother was killed. She was waiting for a bus in Liverpool, and while waiting for a bus, she was hit and run over by an off-duty police officer and died. In speaking to people who knew John from that period of time in his life, they told me that there was a profound change that took place after that horrifying event. I think that at the risk of sounding, you know, as if I'm doing a psychological evaluation of him, I think that had a great deal to do with him having an issue with authority figures.
I get the impression that John always resented authority figures. Even my own father had one slight attempt at putting him right. We were at a skiffle competition, and it was on in an area of Liverpool which was difficult to get to by public transport. So my dad, very unusually, drove us there in his car, and it was a ballroom, and there was, you know, red carpet all over the floor, and we were waiting our turn to go into this competition, and John was smoking his cigarette like this down to the stub, and then it came our turn to play. And John had finished his cigarette, so he dropped it onto this thick red carpet and ground it out and made a huge burn mark on the floor. And my dad said, "I'm sure you don't do that at home, John." The look that John gave him would have slayed him on the spot, you know. So even somebody saying, you know, please don't burn holes in the carpet. If he wanted to burn a hole in the carpet, he would go ahead and burn a hole in the carpet. He couldn't say anything to it.
Nobody controls me. I'm uncontrollable. The only one that can control me is me, and that's just barely possible.
All of those complexes and conflicts and the strangeness of the upbringing, I think, made John a very puzzling person to himself and to everyone else.
But I think he's one of those people who wanted to rebel. He wanted to make rock and roll music. That was rebellious. He wanted to leave Liverpool. That was rebellious. A lot of the things that he did without talking about were inherently rebellious.